everybody, this is GM Jesse Kraai, and today I'm going to look at a very difficult endgame with the rook and rook pawn versus bishop. This is an endgame that really needs to be practiced beforehand before you get the situation in a tournament. Not only is it something where you have to understand the subtleties, but generally it's my experience that especially with today's quick time controls at the end of the game, where not only will you have little time, but you will be a little bit frazzled from the whole affair. You really need to understand things like this before you get them. I myself will show a game that I had, critical last round game that I actually ended up drawing from the opposite, from the rook versus bishop. It was very painful, and really, I thought I knew the position, but I didn't know it well enough, so it's something that really needs to be practiced. Okay, so basically this endgame comes in two types. One where the bishop is the same color as the pawn's queening square, like in this one where we have the light colored bishop, or one with the dark colored or the opposite color to the queening square, which would be in this position a black bishop, and I'm going to look at both. Generally, it's thought that this position is much easier for white to win. In fact, it is, and we're going to talk a little bit about why that's the case. Now, first of all, let's just look at this very basic position, which is fairly easy. A variation could go something like this: rook h6, king b7, king a5, bishop e2, let's say check, king c7. Now notice if he were to go to a7, we could immediately push him back with rook e6 followed by rook e7. So he's got to go out to c7. And then we can do things like we can harass the bishop. And we can use a trick that we'll see in circumstances with the other colored bishop. King b4. Okay, so this is a key trick. What we're trying to do is we're trying to bring our king out. Now, our king was kind of stuck on the side of the board blocking the advance of the pawn. And the basic trick is that if black goes king b6, we'll play king c3, winning the bishop. And this is a key trick in this endgame. Now, white really has to get the king out in order for him to make progress. Once he gets the king out, then he can play a5, rook b6, everything's fine. Okay, so this endgame seems like it's really easy, but I'm going to show an interesting position here that I thought was very fascinating. So let's say the pawn is advanced to a5. Okay, it's king b7, say. Now, this position, it seems like when I first looked at it that it would be very easy. But in fact, it's very difficult. And the solution to this position, I felt, really revealed some of the critical things about this endgame. Okay? So let's go through a variation, and we'll see the critical idea a little bit later. So let's just say white plays normally, rook h6. Bishop d3, king c5, bishop e2. Now black has to basically stay on that diagonal. If he goes away from that diagonal, it'll be very dangerous for him, because we'll be able to have chances to knock the bishop off that diagonal. We're going to see that in some variations a little bit later. Now let's say we play rook b6, king a7 here is forced. If king c7, again we've blocked him off the file, and our king is in a good position. We can just play a6. Pawn is marching, the game's over. So he's got to try king a7. Now, I really recommend trying to solve this yourself. This is kind of an interesting thing, and maybe people will find a solution that I didn't find. I really like the solution I found, but maybe there's another one. If you see it, if you find another solution, go ahead and please email me. I'd be interested. This position, I think, is usually thought to be just completely winning, but I think this position is a little bit like a study that you have to solve, and it's not easy. So let's see what I found. I played rook e6. He has to stand the diagonal. And really the only way to make progress here is to be prepared to jettison the pawn with a6. Now let's take a look at how this might go. Bishop takes a6. Now we can check. King b8, king b6, and the game's over. For example, bishop c8, rook e8. So, at least at the moment, he can't take the pawn. But the problem is, how are we going to make progress if he just, say, makes a move like bishop f1? And really the only way to make progress would be to play king b4, king a5. But if we do it right away, king b4, he can take the pawn. So I came up with this really nice move, rook c6, which isn't immediately obvious what the idea is. Black plays bishop d3. Now we play king b4. Now, if we're allowed to play king a5, it's over. We'll play king a5, rook c7, and march him. So he's got to take. King a5 is the move. Okay? Now, there's a couple things he could try here, but if bishop b7, we'll just play rook c7. We're going to get the position we just had. So maybe his most testing would be to play bishop d3, rook c7, king b8, king b6. And it's only now really that we see the point of rook c6, that he's cut on the c file. Okay? Now, the deeper point that this is revealing is that the only way black can get in any danger from a rook versus bishop endgame without any pawns on the board is when he gets caught in this corner, in this kind of dangerous corner. If he had a dark square bishop, it wouldn't be any problem at all because he could knock the king away from b6. Okay? In this position, though, he's dominated. So maybe if black moves anywhere like e4, f5, we'll just play rook e7 and rook e8 winning. So his only chance really is to hide behind my king. But then he's going to get knocked out like this. Okay, 2, bishop b3, rook a3, and now all of the squares are mined. For example, bishop c4, let's say rook g3. Actually, rook g3 isn't so accurate because he's controlling g8, so we'll play rook e3. And obviously we're threatening rook e8. So if king c8, then we'll see why both c2 and c4 were mined. He has rook c3. So a nice winning plan by white that's study-like and shows, to my mind, one, a position that isn't too well known, but also the theme of the dangerous square, or the dangerous corner for the black king or the defending king. And we're going to see that that's critical in the much more difficult situation of the dark square bishop, which we're going to move to now. So the following position I had as white against GM Strapunsky in Reno 2005, and both sides played poorly. And it's a little bit embarrassing, but at the same time I think it illustrates the need to have a very concrete understanding, a practiced understanding of this type of endgame. Now I'm not going to spend too much time on this position, which I think is one for white, but let's just take a look at how things went. He played king f7, which I think is the right decision. And basically his idea is that when I go chasing this guy, he's going to go after my h-pawn. Okay? So what he's basically doing is he's aiming for the situation where he's going to have the king, we're going to get this endgame he's already seeing in advance with rook and rook pawn versus king and the bishop, which is opposite to the pawn's queening square. So rook a5, king e6, rook a6, king d7. Well played, really, even though it's still a win for white, because what black is aiming for, what black understood is that really there's no chance for him to do anything with his kingside pawns, and he needs to get back immediately to the queen side with the king. So king c7, h5, bishop g3, rook f5, king b7. King a8's a bit of a weird move, but I don't think this is going to change anything. And basically, one thing that's interesting is Strapunsky thought that this was just a draw no matter what. But the basic rule of thumb here is going to be that when you have the bishop opposite the color of the queening square, if the pawn has not advanced to the 5th rank, then it will be a win for white. If you advance it to a5, like we had in the other bishop endgame, the other color of the bishop, then it's a draw. There's no way to win. And we'll see why that's the case in just a little bit. But for the moment, let's continue to see how both sides blunder a little bit here. Okay, so he played bishop e5, king c4, bishop d6, king b5, and now a mistake. Well, really, he's already made a mistake, but let's just see what he does. So bishop g3, he's under the impression that he can just hang out over here, and this is not the most accurate defense for black. And I didn't really understand it during the game either. Now, the key thing for black to understand is that he wants to be on the critical g1 a7 diagonal. If he can be shoved off that diagonal, his chances for defense are basically nothing. Okay? And it'll be one of the key themes for white to knock that bishop off. But in this case, black's essentially given it to me, right? Because the rook on f7 is taking away his entrance to that diagonal on f2. So I went ahead and made some horrible moves here with king a6, but really very simple would have been king b6. And let's just see how that could have gone. Bishop e5, so he's threatening to come back. And watch what white can do. Rook a7, king b8, rook d7. Okay, so now I can come back. I'm threatening rook d8, and I'm taking away the square at d4. Okay, now if, let's say, king c8, I think a simple plan would just be to play rook d5. The bishop has to go somewhere, and then I can play king into a7. So, for example, the game could go something like bishop f2, king a8, and I'm getting ready to play rook d2, rook c2 with a winning position. So black has to prevent that. So, if he were to play king a8, then what I can do in this position, now that I've controlled d4, is now I'm actually ready to move the pawn. The point is he'll never be able to get back on the critical diagonal. Once I've prevented him going to the critical diagonal, there's no hope. So, for example, bishop g3, again we check him. Rook f7, he's again stopped off the diagonal. King a8, a6, let's say bishop e5, and now I can play a7. For example, bishop d4, rook or king a6, and there's no way for black to stop the threat of rook f8. Okay, so mistake by both players. Let's go back and look at how black could have played more tenaciously. So what black needs to do is to get his bishop onto that diagonal as soon as possible. So let's say he went bishop h2, okay, king c4, bishop g1. Okay, so the point is now king b5, bishop e3, say rook f7, king b8, king a6. Just stay on the diagonal. And here we have an interesting position, basically the key theoretical position. And I'm going to show two ways of doing this. One I found on my own, and then in preparation for this lecture, I looked to see what the books did. And I want to show both because repetition is good in a position like this, and because the themes are a little bit different, though essentially the same. And let's talk about what those themes are. The first we've already seen, and that is to put the rook on the b file, gain the b file, so the king is shoved to the c file, and then somehow bring our king back out. And notice, because of the bishop controlling those squares, b8, b6, and a7, it's not going to be so easy. The next thing we want to do is we want to knock the bishop off the g1, a7 diagonal. We'll see that if we can do that, the bishop will oftentimes find it very difficult to actually get back on that diagonal. Once the bishop's on it, though, it's very hard to knock him off because he's just going back and forth. He has a number of squares to choose from. The next thing here is if we can knock him to the d file, we've clearly won. And sometimes we'll see that with, say, if the king, you can imagine the king coming to c6 in a position like this. If we could check him on the c file, we'd shove him to the d file. So that's the next thing. So basically 3 things that black has to avoid. And what we're going to try to do is create a zugzwang position where he will be unable to avoid all of those things happening. So I'm going to show you first the one I found here. And to me it makes the most intuitive sense. And that is just to play rook f1, let him come to c7, and now rook f3. And the idea is that it's very difficult for the black pieces to find comfortable squares. For example, if king c6, then we can play rook f4. The bishop has to move somewhere. Rook c4 is then winning. Nothing black can do about it. So that's not going to work. The next question, bishop g1. Now, the first thing to see about bishop g1, okay, is that there's a lot less scope on g1 for the bishop. In particular, my king could have opportunities of going king a5, king b4. If you imagine my rook on b5, then that's key, because then I would have created that bridge where I hold the black king off and at the same time manage to bring my king back to the c file when I have an easily winning position. So that's why the bishop on g1 is unfortunate. Let's look at a sample variation here. Rook c3, king b8, rook b3. Now, he basically has to go to the c file. If king a8, we can do a variation that we saw earlier. For example, rook g3, bishop h2, rook g8, bishop b8, and now say king b5, king b7, and king b6. And the point is now that we're going to be able to dominate the bishop, and in particular we're going to prevent him from ever coming back to the diagonal he wants to. For example, bishop f4, rook a7 check, king e7, rook e7, stopping bishop e3. And we get an iterative process similar to the one we looked at before. So that's key to remember, that the theme you're looking for, the major theme, is getting that bishop off the diagonal. Okay, so on rook b3, he's really going to have to go to king c7. Okay, and now the easy way to do things here is check him. Now you notice if he goes to c6, we can come back and say bishop e3, rook b3, bishop d2. He's going to eventually be forced to grant us the c file with a winning position. Okay, so for example, bishop c5, we can do a number of things. The easiest is probably just to move like rook c1, and the king has to get off of the c file. Okay. So on rook b7, he's going to have to play king c8, and now we see the problem with bishop g1, because on rook b5, we basically have the very simple threat of playing king a5 to king b4. And let's say the bishop comes back to try to stop us, king a5, but now when he checks us, we have king b6. And we're obviously threatening king c6, and if king b8, and it looks like black's holding, we have this nice move rook f5. Okay, and the bishop will not come back to that diagonal, and we'll be creating the same mate threats we saw in the variation where the bishop gets tied down to the king. Okay, so bishop g1 doesn't work. Let's see here. We want to go back to the position where he moves the bishop g1. Good. Now, the most critical line for him would be king c8. And here I just came up with a very simple thing. Rook d3, bishop f2. Notice that when our rook is on the third rank, he really only has f2 and d4. And the simple idea I came up here was just play rook c3, king b8, force him back to d4 in this position, rook b3. Again, if king a8, rook d3. So he's got to come to the c file, and now we have a very clever trick that we saw in the endgame with the bishop, with the white color bishop, king b5. The point is he can't stop us from playing king c4. And this is just a very key way of getting our king out. Very key trick to know. So that's one way. Let's look at another way. This was the way that Dvoretsky gives in his book. So this is the position that's given in the Dvoretsky book, and I probably it's given in others. And in some ways it's simpler, but it's just good to know the themes, in my opinion. So, for example, what they do is they say rook b7. Again, the king has to go to the c file. Rook b5, king c7, rook b3, and this is the key position, Zugzwang position. Now, notice, let's try bishop f2 first, for example. And the key idea here is king a5. Very nice idea. So, if, for example, bishop d4 now, then we can use the trick that I talked about, king b5. And if bishop e1, now essentially we're free to go. And the point is the bishop's off his diagonal. So the king really doesn't have time to come back because now we dominate the bishop. Okay. So what else can black do here? He could try king c6, maybe is the most challenging. But now we have this very nice move, rook b5. And the point is, if bishop e1, now we play king a6. And now basically black has two problems, and he can't solve both. He has the problem that his bishop's off the diagonal, and his king is unfortunately placed on the c file, where we can knock it off to the d file. For example, the bishop comes back, and we play rook b2, bishop, say e3, rook c2, and the king's going away. So in a lot of ways, this is a very similar endgame to the one I had. But the key thing, I think, probably in your time pressure that you'll find you'll actually get this position is to remember the key ideas, and hopefully you can find a way. I really recommend practicing this position at least 3 times against being able to do it 3 times in a row against strong opposition before you consider yourself competent in it. Now I'm going to show one final trap. So I'm going to end just with a trick that many players have fallen for. In this position, white can win with a number of moves, but if he plays the intuitive move, rook h7, he'll find himself in a little bit of trouble. And the point is that black can give a check, king a6, and now bishop g7. And there's no way for white to make progress. If obviously king b6, we can hit him again with bishop d4. And when the rook goes away anywhere, we're going to play bishop d4, and we'll be threatening the pawn again. And the only way to defend is rook h7. Notice that, of course, if rook d2 and we take the pawn, now we're in the right corner, and there's no way that white can hurt us. For example, rook d8, bishop b8. And in fact, if you have this endgame, rook versus bishop, and you're defending, head for this corner, the opposite color of your bishop, and it'll be very simple to defend. That's a very useful thing to know in these quick time controls. So, this is GM Kraai, and I hope you found this lecture difficult but instructional. Bye-bye.